The woman grunted as she swung down, the log splintering beneath the edge of her axe and burying itself in the stump beneath it. She left the axe there, standing up and stretching, before wiping her brow and staring off into the trees. The woman was about average height and sturdily built, with hair cut short. She was standing in a small clearing, and as she looked toward the west, she could see the top half of the sun setting below the tree line, signifying the coming of night. She sighed before gathering up all the cut wood and tying it down to her self-made pack. The shadows around her steadily lengthened as she hurried home. Her eyes darted from side to side along the path as she periodically checked behind her. She had to get back home before dark. Her grandmother wouldn't be able to take care of herself after the sun set. After a while, she crested a hill and looked down at a small cabin. It was built from logs against a small cliff face at the end of the valley, reinforced with mud and clay. A small amount of smoke rose from the chimney. Surrounding the house were large tree trunks sharpened at the end, pointing outward in a semicircle. Old rusted barbed wire filled the spaces between the spikes. Outside of the wooden and iron defenses was a wide trench about 3 feet deep, filled with more barbed wire, jagged rocks, and broken glass. Laying across the trench at the front was a long plank. It looked more like a shoddily built military camp than a normal cabin in the woods. But it was home. The woman carefully made her way down the hill, avoiding a plethora of tripwires, pitfalls, and other homemade traps before maneuvering herself across the wood board and through the entrance. She dropped her pack and lifted the plank behind her, setting it to one side and sighing with relief. She'd cut it a lot closer than she usually did. The woman preemptively lit a small stone pit fire near the front of the house before stretching and finally letting the day's stresses start to fade away a bit. But, out of the corner of her eye, something caught her attention. She froze mid-stretch before quickly turning and facing the entrance to the cabin. The door was slightly ajar. She stared at the cracked doorway, a feeling of dread slowly sprouting within her before slowly grabbing her axe. She began to cautiously move towards the door, her eyes occasionally flitting around to make sure no one was around. She reached out and slowly pushed the door open, the light from the fire spilling in to reveal an open living room. To one side stood a table surrounded by chairs in front of a fireplace. To the other was a small kitchen and storage area. At the very back stood a doorway. This door was wide open. The light didn't reach inside, but there was still enough day streaming in from behind her for her to see the shadow of someone sitting in her grandmother's bed. The woman allowed herself to relax a little, but still stayed on guard. The fireplace stood cold, and the figure was sitting straight up in bed, unmoving. Something was definitely off. She slowly moved through the house, her eyes never leaving the dark silhouette. She contemplated calling out. Maybe grandmother had just gone to sleep early in a weird position. No. Every instinct in her told her to stay silent. As she crept closer, she became more and more unnerved. Both she and her grandmother were light sleepers. They had to be. Just the sound of her coming home and moving the gangplank should have been enough to wake her up if she'd truly been asleep. Had something happened to her while she'd been away? She came up to the foot of the bed. Her mind fought itself as she stared at the dark figure. She should just call out. She was being silly. What if her grandmother's health had failed her? There was no obvious reason for her to be afraid. No. Something was wrong. She didn't know what, but she needed to stay quiet. She couldn't say anything. Eventually, the woman reached into her back pocket and pulled out a small lighter she'd found months ago. She had to see for herself what was going on. Something was very, very wrong. She took a breath, and with a flick of her thumb, she ignited the lighter. The woman fell back, gasping in horror. Her grandmother's face was twisted, her unblinking eyes staring out straight forwards, a grin so wide it was inhuman, spreading from ear to ear. As the light from the flame flicked across the old woman's face, her eyes snapped towards the source. The woman felt its gaze lock onto her, eyes that were cold, hungry, yet impossibly dead. For the moment, the woman was locked under that gaze, tortured, mourning for the loss of her grandmother, an animalistic fear filling her, screaming at her to get away. Then the moment was over. The woman regained her feet and backed away from the husk that was her grandmother. As she moved, the face slowly turned to track her movements, the eyes locked on her, the smile frozen across the cold face. She backpedaled slowly out of the room, her eyes never leaving the creature, moving back until she felt the door behind her. Why wasn't it coming for her? She didn't know, and in that moment she was grateful that it was staying where it was. She reached behind her, scrambling at the lock, cursing in frustration as she flailed around. By reflex, she glanced back. The second her eyes moved away, she heard the bed creak, footsteps slam into the wood floor, stomping towards her impossibly fast. She jumped to the side as the old woman threw herself across the room, smashing into the door with a weight that was far heavier than what an 80-something-year-old woman should weigh. The door buckled from the impact, giving way and splintering open. A scream from broken and desiccated vocal cords wailed into the night as the woman scrambled towards the fireplace and grabbed a blackened iron rod from the mantel. The old woman crawled back in, her arms and legs mangled, her jaw broken and hanging open, but still in that impossibly wide spread of a smile. Blood trickled down from its lip as it tried to push itself back up, its gaze locked on the figure that was once its granddaughter. It struggled to its feet and took a couple of steps towards her. The woman shrank back into the room, knowing she had to defend herself, knowing that the creature in front of her was no longer who it once was, but only seeing the face of the person who'd raised her. Tears streamed down the woman's face as she held the iron stake out shakily in front of her. As the creature took another step, the broken leg snapped and buckled under the weight, and the creature tumbled forward to the floor. It reached out towards the woman. She steeled herself, focusing on the weight of the weapon in her hand. She'd known this could happen. She knew what she had to do. She could break down later. She took a breath to steady herself before stepping forward. The creature grabbed at her legs, its eyes still locked on her face, the open smile still wide and unmoving. She sidestepped the flailing arms, and with only a moment's hesitation, plunged the stake through the collapsed figure on the floor. A scream echoed throughout the cabin, and then silence. The woman stood there, panting, before stumbling back and falling to the ground, the raw emotions roaring back as she curled into a ball.